Alrighty, good afternoon. We've got a number of regulars in absentia, Irene and the Woolies and etc. But nonetheless, we have a very interesting lesson this morning. We've now transitioned out of the broad historical contexts and we start our work on the destruction of Jerusalem in the late 60s, early 70s. So, as I wait for the second emergency vehicle to go past. So, what we're going to be doing over the coming weeks is we're going to be examining the fall and the destruction of Jerusalem in what, using just kind of scholarly terms, is referred to as the Jewish-Roman War, or the First Jewish-Roman War, but otherwise gets described as the fall of Jerusalem, which specifically and particularly occurs in 70 AD, but there's obviously a lot of context that builds up into that. And so this afternoon is particularly going to be covering the rising kind of tensions and turmoil and calamities that set the stage and build it up in the years and indeed decades leading up to the late 60s and then eventually of course to 70 AD itself. So to just give you a very brief recapping of the actual historical background of which we've seen thus far throughout these past few weeks regarding specifically, Jerusalem or Judea itself. So Judea is conquered by the Romans under Pompey the Great in 63 BC, okay, and they become a vassal state of the then Roman Republic, right? So that was the Hasmonean kingdom at that particular point under the Hasmonean rulers, which had been around for about 100-ish years, nearly 80 to 100 years by that point. Down the track, a couple of decades later, in 40 BC, Herod the Great is crowned king of the Jews by the Roman Senate. Okay, and it's at that point that then that begins a process of a couple of years, which then eventually in 37 BC, the Hasmonean dynasty is overthrown and Herod the Great becomes the new dynastic ruler of what we call the Herodian kingdom. Okay, and he rules there for nearly 40 years, down through to his death in, roughly speaking, 4 BC, into which then the Herodian kingdom is then divided into a tetrarchy, right? We covered that, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, specifically looking at, yes, it was 3 weeks ago, looking specifically at this tetrarchy, which was made up of 3 of Herod's sons, Herod Archelaus, Herod Philip, and Herod Antipas, as well as and the fourth being his sister Salome the First. Okay, and so it's from that point then that Judea eventually goes on through the decades, through the time of Christ, his birth, life, ministry, death, the early first decade of the Acts of the Apostles, which we've been covering thus far, up until Acts chapter 10, 11, 12, which is where we're up to right now in our Bible study. And then you get to the last major unified ruler, which was Herod Agrippa I, who reigns from AD 41 to AD 44. Okay, and he'll come up more as we go through this afternoon. From that point onward, with him being the last, let's just call it semi-autonomous ruler of Judea and surrounding territories, Judea and the surrounding provinces then return back to direct Roman rule under what are called procurators from that point onward, AD 44 and onward. Up until that point, it had been up until the point of, that is to say, Herod Agrippa I, it had been after the tetrarchy who was slowly crumbling and one of them would die off here, then another one would die off there. Rome had been administering Judea under the prefects. So prefects, obviously, we're famous. We know one of them, which is going to be Pontius Pilate, okay, prefect of Judea. The procurators is something, again, we'll cover that as we go through. But that's the broad synopsis of where we are in the, decades before and after Christ's birth. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's the brief historical recap, and again, those details will weave their way through what we're looking at this morning. And so a lot of this, certainly first off, is going to be regarding the kind of rising tensions and turmoil that exist in not just Judea, but also the surrounding parts, particularly of the eastern empire, part of the empire, but indeed, in many cases, all around the empire, that is to say, all around the world. And so what we find is, on the good side of the equation, the Christian side, we find the gospel advancing throughout all of the known world. It's not very long, all but a couple of decades before even by the 50s, we already have the gospel being preached all the way over in the Roman province of what would at that time, certainly by 43, when the Romans invade Britain in AD 43, and then eventually finally conquer it by like the late 80s. We already have the gospel being preached in Britain, that is to say the island of Great Britain, so it hasn't reached Hibernia or Ireland yet, but it's reached Great Britain, which is the furthest extent of the empire and of the known world, all the way across to India. Right, so the Apostle Thomas, travels eastward, travels through Persia, he preaches through Arabia, preaches through Persia, what the lands of Persia would be. Then it was called the Parthian Empire. And so he preaches throughout the Parthian Empire, then eventually continues over to Bactris and modern-day Afghanistan, which in those days was very Hellenic. So you had Greek cities and people speaking Greek in Afghanistan. Hard to wrap our heads around these days. And he travelled all the way down, went further than Alexander the Great ever went, travelled across the Indus Valley River, the Indus Valley civilization, and then ended up all the way down down in India itself, which was the absolute furthest extremities of the world at that point. So by the time we even get to 70 AD, before that you already have the gospel being preached in every corner of the world. And that comes up, obviously that kind of statement comes up in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24. Jesus describing this time of great tumult and great chaos and calamity, and explaining that the gospel will go forth though, and it will be preached in all the world. And you have this occurring already by the 50s. You'll notice there that I've got the two examples of this, as I mentioned earlier, the Apostle Thomas. As a missionary to India, he arrives somewhere around the year 52 AD, so the early 50s nonetheless. And then over in Britain you have Aristobulus, who was the first bishop of Britain. He arrived either in AD 37 or AD 54. The reason why there is some debate is because we're told historically that he arrived in the year of the death of the Emperor Tiberius. The issue, though, is that you have the emperor that we commonly call Tiberius, which is the one after Augustus, who was known as Tiberius Caesar. But then the emperor two after him, who reigned from 41 to 54, we commonly call him Claudius, but his full name was Tiberius Claudius Caesar. So which Tiberius is being talked about is a debate. Either way, though, whether it's 37 or 54, I would suggest the evidence probably leans stronger towards 54, mainly because the Romans invade Britain in 43 AD. This was not the first time. They tried to invade back in 55 BC under Julius Caesar, and the native Celtic Britons were successful in repelling Caesar and his army. They then came back again nearly 100 years later in 43, and they were successful this time. And Britain would become a Roman province for 400 years, basically, till 410. So I would suggest that probably Aristobulus came in the wave of Romans coming into Britain after they'd begun their invasion in 43. Otherwise, you have to have Aristobulus travelling it beyond the empire itself, which is not out of the question because the Apostle Thomas travelled outside the empire to the absolute skirts of the world, outskirts of the world, but I suggest it's probably 54. Either way, though, it doesn't particularly matter all that much because you have, in the first century, the gospel already reaching all corners of the world, which is just incredible. We know from other historical sources that the gospel had reached what was called the province of Hispania, so the Iberian Peninsula, what today is Spain and Portugal, which are the Roman province as well, of course. And Aristobulus did preach there. Aristobulus preached to the Celtiberians, which are the Celtic peoples of northern, what today is northern Spain, and on his way to Britain, having launched from the Church at Rome. And so this is the Aristobulus, by the way, who's, or almost certainly, the Aristobulus that's mentioned in Romans chapter 16. I don't know if anyone's read the ending of Romans, the book of Romans, but Paul basically in chapter 16 gives a bunch of salutations to his proverbial Christmas card list of people. It's just a list of people in the Church of Rome. Aristobulus and the household of Aristobulus is mentioned there in verse 10. Right, so Paul, the Apostle Paul, giving his salutations, give my greetings, my blessings to the house of Aristobulus, who had obviously launched this missionary trip to Britain via Hispania, from the Church of Rome. So he's mentioned in Scripture there as well. What we find, though, is that even amidst that happening, the specific context of the first world, for the first century world, the first century was very much a time of this rising political kind of and socio-cultural tension and instability, particularly not just on the political front, but the social and cultural front as well, kind of spilling over or in tandem even with the political aspect of what was going on there. By the time we get to the outbreak of the Jewish-Roman War itself, which was specifically between, at least on paper historically, 66 to 73, so it was a 7-year period. The specifics, though, was from the kind of what ultimately, in terms of actual time, is 3.5 years between 66 and 70, and the fall of Jerusalem there in 70 AD, and the other 3.5 years is basically just kind of the proverbial clean-up process, and the kind of putting out of the smaller skirmishes after the fall. What you have as well politically that's worth pointing out here is that by the time we get to that point, let's just show where we are historically in terms of emperors. You've had the current reigning emperor, Nero, so Nero Caesar, who reigns from 54 to 68. Okay, 54 to 68, right? So he is the emperor when this war kicks off. He then commits suicide, 2-ish years in, and we'll cover Nero as we go through, obviously. But he's the emperor when this is going down, okay? And when this is breaking out. You've had 5, and I'm going to call it 5, and I'll explain why I call it 5 with hesitancy. But you've had 5 emperors up until this point. You've had Julius Caesar, Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, and Claudius. Now, again, on paper historically, Augustus is, technically speaking, the first emperor, and it's perfectly okay to say that Augustus is the first emperor just from an academic perspective. He's the first one that kind of unify. He defeats the traitors and the assassins of Julius Caesar. He defeats the enemies of Julius Caesar, particularly Mark Antony and Cleopatra. He is the one who is not crowned, because they're not kings, but he's the one who's awarded the title or appointed as Augustus, meaning the revered or the renowned, the best, the greatest, by the Roman Senate in 27 BC. So on paper historically, Augustus, generally speaking, is the first emperor. The issue, though, is what do we define as the first emperor versus what did people in that time period define as the first emperor? Because the reality is that there would be no such thing as the Roman emperors if it weren't for Julius Caesar. After all, they are called the Caesars. Okay, the very legitimacy of the position in this transition out of republic and into empire, not that they considered it that, because again their whole point was this was the restored republic, but their whole basis politically for legitimacy was, in the case of Augustus, I am the adopted son and rightful heir of Julius Caesar, who's been deified, he's now divine, which makes me a son of a god. Right, so the whole thing doesn't work if it's not in connection to Julius Caesar. Moreover, and just as importantly, we have historical writings from the 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century AD that clearly indicate that on the popular common level, Julius Caesar was regarded as the first. Okay, that's why the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC was the entirely wrong move politically, because you had these 70 senators who were worried that Caesar was going to crown himself king, and so they assassinated him in the Senate, stabbed him to death, and went about the city proclaiming the tyrant is dead, and they were met with just dead silence and shock, because Caesar was unbelievably popular among the lower and middle class of Rome. So it backfired completely. That's why Augustus was able to swoop in as the successor of Julius Caesar. So Julius Caesar, in the popular convention, many historians have argued, and I do too, that Julius Caesar is, culturally speaking, the first emperor as regarded in the 1st century. Okay, so you have Julius Caesar, Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and then now from 54 to 68, emperor is the current reigning emperor. It's also worth pointing out too, in regards to this concept of political instability, all of those figures that I just mentioned, all 5 of those, and well, technically 6 if you include Nero, all of them but Augustus, all of them except Augustus were assassinated. There's some distinction to be drawn with some of them. They didn't all die in the same ways. So Tiberius the evidence suggests that he was, so the second/third emperor, right, the one after Augustus, was on, there is evidence to suggest that he was assassinated by a conspiracy or by a plot led by Caligula. There is some debate historically how that went down. Some sources say he died of natural causes. Some say he was smothered with a pillow. The difference is, though, that all the stories contain him being smothered with a pillow. So it's almost like, was he smothered with a pillow, went kind of into asphyxiation, but then kind of came back and then died of natural causes a couple of days later? Or did he, like most of the sources say, did he go sick with fever, for example, and then people thought he was, because the main account of what happened is that he went, fell sick. Caligula then starts coordinating the succession and is practically made the successor while Tiberius is on his deathbed, but Tiberius then recovers. So then someone smothers him with a pillow, right? So long story short, almost certainly assassinated. Same with Caligula. Caligula was assassinated by the Praetorian Guard in cahoots with the Senate, and this is the first instance of a proud and long-standing Roman tradition of the Royal Imperial Guard assassinating the person they're meant to protect. This is the first instance of what becomes the absolute standard and norm among the Roman emperors, which is assassinations by the Praetorian Guard, the elite Roman Imperial Guard, in conspiracy with the Senate to have a new emperor. Caligula's the first, which is ironic because Caligula assassinated his predecessor. And so Caligula is then assassinated, just like he assassinated his predecessor. He's assassinated by Claudius, who then eventually is assassinated by Nero. Nero is the only one who's not assassinated, although he kind of sort of was. He committed suicide after he was abandoned by the Praetorian Guard and the Senate, and basically drove himself into insanity and committed suicide. So it's going fantastically for the Roman emperors up to this point. Keeping in mind that also Julius Caesar, again, was assassinated famously in 44 BC by Brutus and Cassius, and leading the famous 70 Roman senators to assassinate him in the most famous assassination ever. So it's just marked by assassination, this Julio-Claudian dynasty. That does not breed stability, that breeds the very opposite. It's the definition of political instability. Assassination after assassination after assassination. And keep in mind, as we saw with that Roman context that we had a couple of weeks ago, this is already on the back of 13 civil wars practically in the span of about 120 to 150 years. So that's the last 120 to 150-ish years of Roman Republican history, right up until the proverbial crowning or the appointment of Augustus, is civil war after civil war after civil war after civil war, including the assassination of Julius Caesar, which launches another civil war between Augustus and Mark Antony, which then ends with Augustus winning and unifying the empire, or the republic, as they would say, and the republic then. And that doesn't end the political turmoil, because then all it begins is he happens to die of natural causes and is the first one for a while that actually dies of natural causes, and then you have emperor after emperor after emperor after emperor being assassinated. Right? It's the definition of political instability. It's the definition of chaos. It's the definition of turmoil and troubles and everything else in between. Okay, so it's vitally important to kind of see that in the light of, this is not just even the Judean context, so the Jewish context. This is going on all around the empire, is just marked by this kind of instability and this kind of tumultuous kind of upheaval. As I mentioned, the reign of Nero then comes in 54 AD through to 68, and it itself ramps up to a new level, that particularly kind of significant turmoil and instability. We have ancient sources from not just the first century, but outside of that as well. Not just Christian sources, but Jewish and particularly Roman sources, and the particular Roman sources are relatively clear on this, at least relatively speaking. They indicate, reasonably clearly that there were a number of writers from the first century who were quite concerned about whether or not the empire would even last, basically. Whether or not the empire would even actually sustain itself. There were serious issues of deep concerns about the empire collapsing, about the empire not actually surviving this kind of tumultuous upheaval that it was experiencing throughout the first century around the empire in multiple levels, the imperial level, the territorial level, the kind of magistrate level, and the lower level, multiple levels of turmoil and of various strifes. Israel, right, Judea was no exception to this, except they were practically the example par excellence. They were deeply divided in the first century by various antagonistic oppositional factions, ranging in ideology, that can broadly, it's a lot more complex than this, but just for our sake, broadly speaking, can be understood along a spectrum of those who are more, I'm importing modern terms here, but liberal, lowercase l, liberal, very pro-Roman, or at least willing to have the Romans there, all the way to being just completely like full-blown Roman sycophants, down to the opposite end, which is, at the furthest extent, violent, absolutely violent and warlike patriotic nationalism, which was intent on slaughtering every Roman that happened to glance their way. Okay, a wide spectrum, right? It's more complex than that. Multiple factions, like literally, a dozen plus legitimate factions at least among the Jews of all those kinds of different things. You get a picture of this, by the way, in the Gospels. In regards to like Matthew or to tax collectors, right? The opinion that you get levied in the Gospels about tax collectors, about how tax collectors were seen as basically traitors to the Jewish people, because they were Jews who were then working basically for the Roman authorities and for the treasury at the temple particularly, in taking money in the form of tax from the Jews and giving it to the authorities, in this case the Romans, right? So they were treated horribly because of that job, and you get a picture of that in the Gospels. That's just the story account of exactly what I'm talking about here, of this deep, not just political, but like socio-cultural factionalism and divide that existed there, and it brought this massive socio-political polarization throughout Judea. Okay? So, what this does is provide a setting which is not conducive to political or national or ethnic cohesion, religious cohesion, and this is only made worse, as one could probably expect, by a series of corrupt Roman prefects and procurators. Okay, I mentioned earlier that from the time of the Herodian Tetrarchy, so after the death of Herod the Great, through to the semi-autonomous reign for that 4 years between AD 41 and 44 of Herod Agrippa I, you had prefects. Okay, prefect was a magisterial term. So it was like a magistrate. It's complex as to what a prefect was, but they were kind of an administrative position, right? Had a bit of a military overtone to it, but it was very much an authoritative position. Prefect had a different definition at different times throughout Roman history, right? So when Pontius Pilate is the prefect of Judea, that's his particular position. After the reign of Herod Agrippa, who is semi-autonomous, and he comes up later, so I'll explain why later, you then have the Romans institute procuratures, right? So they're now actually appointing a different type of role, basically the same authority. So it's not like greater authority in terms of actual power, but a different type of job, a different description and a different conceptualization. The procurators were as government bureaucrat as it gets. In fact, their actual literal job as procurators was being in charge of the finance and more specifically tax. So this is tantamount to being run by the ATO. Okay, which I'm sure we would all just be so deeply grateful for if we're all ruled and governed by the Australian Taxation Office. This is pretty much what the procurators are at this point, okay? So it's super duper government bureaucrat, which just makes it even worse, because you have a line of just painfully corrupt procurators to varying degrees, particularly Felix, who's around in the 50s AD. You then have, you're familiar with one of them if you're familiar with the end of the book of Acts in the chapters 21, 22, 23, 24, etc., particularly 24 and 25. The Apostle Paul comes before Festus. He's the procurator of Judea, okay? He was actually one of the decent ones, which is saying something, but painfully corrupt. And had a series of them which just makes things worse and worse and worse. From the reign of Caligula onward, so that kind of 37 to 41 AD, who again, keeping in mind, Caligula assassinated his predecessor. He reigns for a pretty short amount of time, or relatively short, but a couple of years, and is then assassinated himself by Claudius. right? But from that time onward is where we start to see a ramping up of these, to coin the biblical phrase, these wars and rumours of wars, right? It increases dramatically. All the political turmoil, the issue about wars going on here and there, uprisings, riots. This afternoon is going to be a lot about rioting, because like the Romans had a long-standing and proud tradition of assassinating their emperors, the Jews had developed by this point a long-standing and proud tradition of rioting over the slightest or the greatest of inconveniences. And so that's where we kind of tend to end up with. The socio-cultural tensions in the eastern provinces particularly, it is a complex issue. It is something that requires a lot more detail, but because we're getting the summary here this morning. But we're going to try and boil down what those were, right? In relatively simple terms, they can essentially be conceptualized like this, especially in connection to Judea, just in the eastern provinces, okay? Because keeping in mind that Judea isn't the only place where Jews are. Okay, there's Jews all around the empire, even beyond the empire to the east, but all around the empire. You may recall on the day of Pentecost, for example, so Acts chapter 1, Acts chapter 2, you have a bunch of people in Jerusalem for a high holy day. Okay, in this case, Pentecost, the Feast of Weeks. They're from all over, and Acts chapter 2 details where they're from. You have Jews from as nearby as, obviously like Galilee, and Syria, the Phoenician city-states like Tyre and Acre and so on, and Sidon, all the way out to as far away as Cyrene in North Africa, which is basically modern-day Libya near Benghazi, Alexandria, Egypt, all the way up in the province of Asia, so West Turkey. You have them coming from, even Rome's listed there. You even have Jews from east of the Roman Empire over in the Parthian Empire, right? But nonetheless, you have them from as far away as Rome. So there's Jews all around the empire, which was the diaspora that had occurred, so the dispersing, the movements, migrations that had occurred under Alexander the Great and his successors, the Hellenistic period, okay? So the eastern provinces are filled with Jews all over the place. That's why the Apostle Paul or anyone else is able to first go into a city, and who do they preach to first? The Jews in the synagogues. Because there's a synagogue in Athens, synagogue in Ephesus, synagogue in Pergamum, right, all over the place. There's synagogues there because the Jews are in all those cities, right, and then they go to the Gentiles. But broadly speaking, the conflicts in the eastern provinces can be understood particularly in this way. You have ethnic tensions between people groups, right, particularly Jews versus Greeks, so ethnic Greeks, not Hellenistic Jews, ethnic Greeks, and Hellenistic Jews, so Jews, I'm saying around the empire, like I just mentioned, who are steeped in Greek culture, versus what I'm just going to call here Hebraic Jews, right? So Jews in Jerusalem and Judea who would be speaking Aramaic as opposed, generally speaking, it's a rule of thumb, but generally speaking Aramaic as opposed to Greek, okay? So Aramaic is a Semitic language, it's related to Hebrew, but in and around the orbit of Jerusalem geographically is what I'm referring to here, okay? The makeup of the Church of Jerusalem, certainly for the first, decade or opening decades, was basically almost exclusively Jewish, and it was literally just exclusively Jewish, but it was Hebraic Jews and Hellenistic Jews. The reason why you have the creation of the diaconate, so the deacons, in Acts chapter 6, is specifically over fighting that broke out in the Church of Jerusalem between the Hebraic Jews and the Hellenistic Jews. Okay? The Hebraic Jews, the more steeped in Hebrew culture, language, etc., were delving out more alms, that is to say resources, to their widows and neglecting the Hellenistic Jews. Okay, so there was tension between Hebraic Jews and Hellenistic Jews all over the place. Right, so you had Jews versus ethnic Greeks, so it was a very clear ethnic divide, and then proverbial infighting between the Hebraic Jews and the Hellenistic Jews. Okay, that's one very important component of the kind of socio-cultural tension and turmoil. The second is that of conflict between, on a more cultural or indeed political level, between Roman law and the kind of native indigenous customs of that area. So I explained in weeks previous that when Rome conquered a place, they would need to incorporate the local culture and system and everything else in between into and under the empire, because the empire is so big, it's literally you can't do it on that level without cooperations down the proverbial rung or ladder. Does that make sense? And so tensions or conflict between Roman law being imposed versus conflicting areas of the native or indigenous customs and culture and mores and so on, that was a cause of conflict. And then thirdly, coming back to, particularly on the Jewish side, and that plays out obviously, that Roman law versus indigenous customs thing is all over the New Testament, of the conflict between Jewish custom and law from the Old Testament versus Roman law being imposed upon them. Fascinatingly and interestingly, the Jews clearly, by a country mile, had the most level of autonomy, I say that in inverted commas, than anyone else in the empire, by a country mile. They had the most amount of tolerance given to them by the Romans. Does that make sense? Which is not a good thing, though, because what it ends up leading to is exactly what this instance of the first century is, exactly what this wicked and corrupt generation that Christ refers to there, particularly in Matthew's kind of 23 to 21 to 25. You have a scenario where they're completely in bed with the Romans. I mean, after all, again, keeping in mind, Herod the Great was crowned king of the Jews by whom? The Roman Senate. Okay? So the very political structure of Judea at this point, and it has been for practically, nearly 100 years by this point, is entirely Roman sanctioned, Roman backed, Roman supported, Roman maintained, Roman funded, and Roman defended. Okay? And so that's that second point. And then the third point is kind of tying into that, right? The civil rights of Jews in the Roman Empire, which, as I said, they had more autonomy than anyone else, pretty much. But nonetheless, there was still this great tension between our local Jewish customs versus the imperiousness of the Roman system upon them, okay? Those are the summary of these different types of political and socio-cultural tension. So, moving into the specifics of what we kind of find with regards to the actual setting of the first century world and leading up into 70 AD itself. Okay, so this is where we're going to start to nail down some particular examples of things that are going on. So you'll see in your notes that during the reign of Caligula, okay, so Caligula's reigning from 37 to 41, which we mentioned earlier, back up in your notes there, further up the page. So AD 37 to AD 41. During that time, the Roman prefect of Egypt was a man named Aulus Avilius Flaccus. Okay, not terribly popular with the emperor, but was influential enough to be in that position. He was not popular with Caligula by virtue of the fact that mainly he had known support, he was known to have support from native Alexandrian or Egyptian separatists, so Egyptians who did not want to be under the Roman Empire. Okay, and so that kind of political connection tends to make the emperors uneasy about you. So he was not on good footing anyway with the Roman Emperor. We get to the point of about 40 AD, where just due to concern, due to superstition or anything else in between, Caligula sends at this point, well, certainly he hasn't been crowned king yet, but he's a very prominent, obviously he's a Herodian. He sends Agrippa I basically on an unannounced diplomatic visit to Alexandria to essentially kind of passively check in on Flaccus and make sure that he's actually doing what Caligula wants him to do without announcing that intention. Herod Agrippa I has not been crowned king of the Jews yet, but he's well on that way. We'll get on to him in a second as to how this kind of ties in, as to why he was in that position. Nonetheless, this visit wasn't particularly well welcomed by the local Greek population, keeping in mind Egypt was one of those 4 kingdoms after Alexander, so part of the Diadochi, called the Ptolemaic kingdom, and it was the last one to fall. Okay, so Augustus is appointed emperor, or Augustus, after he's defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra. So the famous Cleopatra, she was the last ruler, the last pharaoh of the Ptolemaic kingdom. So Greek Egypt, in other words, Hellenistic Egypt. So it was the last place to end being Greek and now become Roman. So it has a long-standing and very recent Greek heritage. So there's Greeks all throughout Alexandria, Egypt. Alexandria, Egypt is the most important Alexandrian city. There were, I think Alexander the Great built 26 Alexandrias around the world. This is the most famous by far. And it's a Greek city through and through. I mean, it practically might as well be Athens. okay, for all intents and purposes at least. So the visit of this Jewish royal is not met well. The Greeks jeer him, basically. They mock Agrippa upon his arrival, so there's already tension in Alexandria, in the city, upon this whole visit. In order to try and placate both the Greeks, who are disgruntled, and the emperor, who he knows is trying to check on him, Flaccus makes basically, pulls this genius political move, and I say that sarcastically, of placing a prominent statue of Caligula in the synagogues of Alexandria. And this did not go down all that famously with the Jews, who then turned around and rioted in the city. Okay, and so then you had the Jewish riot of Alexandria in AD 40. Okay, so what I'm doing here, I'm trying to show you the different ways in which this is occurring. It's not even just occurring in Judea, it's occurring around the world, right? These tensions and these spillovers, these fights, full-blown riots, civil unrest, right? This is the embodiment of the concept of wars and rumours of wars. What you find going forward from that point, this kind of further develops the historical detailing for us. Herod Agrippa is then crowned king of the Jews in AD 41. He reigns from AD 41 to 44. This occurs after the death of Caligula and the accession of his successor Claudius. Here's where I was highlighting earlier in regards to this whole business about Herod Agrippa and how he informs a lot of the history here. Herod Agrippa, who is the grandson of Herod the Great at this point, okay, through Salome I, he's the grandson of Herod Agrippa. Herod Agrippa is the grandson of Herod the Great, I should say. He was raised in the Roman imperial house in Rome. Okay, that's why he's called Agrippa. Agrippa is not a Jewish name. He's named after the famous first century BC Roman general Agrippa. Right, so Agrippa is a Roman name, not a Hebrew name. Right, his name is a completely Roman name. And named after a famous Roman general from 50 to 100 years prior to himself. He was raised alongside Claudius. They're a year apart. Herod Agrippa was born in 11 BC, Claudius was born in 10 BC. They were raised together as children. They were practically best friends, for all intents and purposes. So when Claudius ascends to the position of Augustus, which was really a throne but not really, in 41 AD, he then crowns his childhood friend as king of the Jews. So this was the first time that someone had been crowned king of the Jews since Herod the Great. Right? Rome had been up until AD 41, as I mentioned earlier, directly administered by the Roman prefects over the Herodian tetrarchy, which waned and weaned over time. Now you had a relatively autonomous king of the Jews. And so this is further bolstering the nationalistic fervour of those more conservative Jews in the first century, yeah? But at the same time, though, the reason why he's a semi-autonomous, the reason why he had as much political freedom and lateral as he had, was because he was absolutely, completely and utterly loyal to the Roman imperial house. Do you see the problem here? Do you see the points being made? Completely in bed with Rome. Completely in cahoots. Literally, childhood friends raised in the Roman imperial house. Right? They're completely joined at the hip. They're wedded at this point, the Jews and the Romans. Right? This is why all this imagery about apostasy and about rebellion against God is utilised in these kinds of texts. It's because of this. Okay? It's because of this joining that has occurred between the two. He comes to the throne because he ousted his successor, the last of the Herodian tetrarchy, Herod Antipas. And so he ousts him and then is ascended to the crown as king of the Jews. Antipas is then exiled by the emperor. So this ends the Herodian tetrarchy and clearly establishes Herod Agrippa as the sole unified, Roman-backed ruler over the entire province of Judea and the surrounding territories. Okay, so it's unified in that sense. But even amidst all that, we still have increasing instability and turmoil in Judea and around the world, around the empire. It's worth adding in here just a very brief side tangent. kind of in and amidst this, that despite the proverbial doom and gloom that I'm levying here this morning, the church at Jerusalem, as well as the church around the world at this point, because by the time we're here, in the early 40s, you already have the church at Antioch starting to flourish. We've just been recounting that in our Bible study in the book of Acts. And then as the decades go through to the 50s and then the 60s, you've got churches all over the empire practically by this point, well beyond just the churches that we have listed in, the letters written by Paul particularly. And the church, though, specifically in Jerusalem, who becomes our main focus over these coming weeks, is continuing to flourish, right? They're still persecuted by the Jewish authorities. They're persecuted by the Roman authorities. So they're persecuted on both sides of this proverbial equation, right? But they're continuing to grow, continuing to flourish, continuing to do everything that they're commanded to do, right? And they're persevering. They're enduring very, very well under increasing persecution. The actions of the Church of Jerusalem will become, an important focal point for us, obviously, at church history. Once we go through these weeks, we'll account the commands they were given in the Olivet Discourse and elsewhere about what they were to do during this time, and then they will then see how the fact that even Josephus, who was an eyewitness to all of this, who was in and amongst the Jewish-Roman War, describes what the Christians did during that time. And so that'll be hopefully edifying and informative for us as we kind of go through. But nevertheless, during this time, the church at Jerusalem is continuing to flourish, and they are successfully enduring under the face of increasingly violent and tumultuous, tribulation and persecution of all kinds and varieties. Let me give you two such examples of this kind of turmoil that kind of will continue to paint that picture for us. Okay, so if you see as you continue down through your notes there, we have that rioting that we saw in Alexandria in AD 40. Okay, when you have statues of the emperor being ordered to be erected, not just in Alexandria like we had under Flaccus, but you also then eventually have in 40 AD right around that time as what was going on in Alexandria. But based upon the riots, the kind of response that we get from the emperor is in response to that rioting, he decides to basically double down, essentially. He decides to up the ante and orders for a giant statue of him to be built in the temple itself in Jerusalem. Herod Agrippa basically convinces him, for sure, don't do that. Don't go down that road. Caligula listens to him. And it's not even a year before Caligula is eventually then assassinated anyway. And so, because he was going to reinstitute it, we have evidence that he was actually going to go. He retracted the order, but then had plans to actually go back and go and do it, but then he gets assassinated by Claudius. So it doesn't come to be. But this notion of emperors being worshipped in the temple is something which comes up in 70 AD. It's something which gets referenced in the scriptures, and it's something that was not without precedent, because Caligula tried to do it himself, 30-ish years prior. Another such example, a bit later on that decade, now we're into the reign of Claudius by this point, and so kind of between AD 46 to 48, you had break out in Judea what's called the Jacob and Simon uprising. It's named eponymously after these two Jewish brothers who launched not so much an insurrection, more like an insurgency. Okay, so like what you saw in the Iraq War, once the Americans and the Australians and the Brits went through and conquered Iraq in literally 3 weeks, ousted Saddam, put him to death, and then began the insurgency from Al-Qaeda, right? So there was more of an insurgency. It's 46 to 48. It started slow, kind of progressed more, and it kind of reached this like climax basically in 48, where the Romans then kind of dropped the anvil on them, crushed the rebellion entirely, and both the brothers were then executed. Okay, so you can see here, across the years, across the decades, there's riots, there's insurrections, / insurgencies, right? Armed and unarmed, and we're going to get onto the heavy one in a minute, the one that kicks off the actual Jewish-Roman War. But you have not this war occurring in isolation, as if it's just something that kind of just plopped along. It's literally not just decades, it's practically centuries in the building, but certainly in at least the particular political and socio-cultural environment, it's decades and decades and decades, generations and generations in the making. Does that make sense? Yeah, generations in the making. So it's at this point that we'll now turn our attention specifically, having built that up, to the specifics of the beginning of the Jewish war, right? Which is what Josephus calls it, otherwise known as the Jewish-Roman War, the First Jewish-Roman War, right? Which begins with the Jewish revolt. Sometimes the whole war is referred to as the Jewish revolt. Again, it depends on whether you're reading Jewish sources, Roman sources, Christian sources, whichever one. For the sake of this, just so we're clear, the Jewish revolt I'm going to use in the context of the actual revolt which kicks off the war. Does that make sense? So when I'm saying Jewish revolt, I'm talking about the basically 5-month events that occurred in AD 66. Okay, so I'm referring to the revolt as the specific, match that lit the spark, and then the war is what comes as a result of this. Does that make sense? Just so we're on the same page? Okay. So, recapping what we got. You've got Emperor Nero as the emperor from 54 to 68. Okay, so this is occurring during the tail end of his reign. We're not talking about Nero here today. We're going to talk about him in coming weeks because he's vitally important. Understanding what was going down with Nero is really, really important to what happens with the Jewish-Roman War. But you have, as procurator of Judea during this time, a Roman official named Gessius Florus, who I'll just simply refer to as Florus from here on out. Okay, so he's procurator of Judea from AD 64 to 66. Okay, most procurators tended to serve about that time, roughly speaking, 2, 4, 6 kind of years, roughly. What ends up happening is that in 66, earlier months of AD 66, fighting breaks out between the Greeks and the Jews. So again, this is not Hellenistic Jews. This is Greeks, actual Greeks. Okay. Caesarea Maritima, for those who have been in our Bible study, has come up a number of times. We've been in Caesarea Maritima a number of occasions. We've been in there recently as well, over these chapters of the book of Acts that we've been going through. Caesarea Maritima, okay, so there's Caesarea on the coast, up in, basically Phoenician land, is the capital of the province of Judea. Okay, so Jerusalem's not the capital. Jerusalem was, in fact, never the capital of the province of Judea, at least for the vast majority of the time. Okay, Caesarea Maritima, up on the coast, north in the province, is the capital of Judea, not Jerusalem. Jerusalem's the biggest city, it's the most important city, but it's not the capital. Right? It's like what Sydney and Melbourne are compared to Canberra, if you want to think of it roughly that way. Okay, Caesarea Maritima is where the Roman palace was, basically the prefect, or at this point the procurator's palace was. Had a Roman amphitheatre there. It was an entirely Greek-built city. It was built recently. It was built in the 1st century under Augustus, and was named in his honour. Hence Caesarea, right? Caesar. It's named after Caesar. This is not to be confused with Caesarea Philippi, which is over toward Damascus near Syria, which is where Christ in John 10 or John chapter 12, whichever one it is, makes that famous proclamation, where Peter proclaims, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And then Christ says, "Upon this rock," in other words, the rock that Christ is Lord, "I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not overcome it." That's in Caesarea Philippi. This is Caesarea Maritima, the capital. Okay, so that's important. This is going down in the capital. It's not just some old city. It's going down in the capital of Judea. Okay, important provincial and magisterial seat. You have fighting break out between the Jews and the Greeks, and this was because of a particular incident. In this case, a bunch of Greeks had been sacrificing in front of, at this merchant house near the synagogue in Caesarea. They'd been sacrificing unclean birds right in front of the temple, right? Were they being intentionally provocative? Maybe, probably, almost certainly, who knows, all in between. But this was taken as a massive insult and an affront by the Jews in Caesarea Maritima. The issue is that the Romans really do pretty much nothing about it. The Roman authorities and the troops do very little, basically nothing, to intervene in this kind of gradually devolving crisis in Caesarea Maritima. And of course, when the authorities fail to do their job to maintain public order, you end up getting real problems. Kind of in protest of this, the high priest at the time, or was actually, well, not one of the high priests, it's one of the it's actually one of the kind of underlings, ends up basically cancelling or postponing, stopping prayers and sacrifices for the emperor at the temple in Jerusalem. Okay? So when I say prayers and sacrifices for the emperor, it's not prayers and sacrifices to the emperor, right? So they're not honouring him as a god necessarily, but they're giving prayers and making sacrifices to Yahweh for the emperor's well-being, that the emperor would reign and the emperor would do good, for the emperor, not to the emperor. So I just wanted to make sure no one's confused on that. Still though, those prayers would have been very pro-emperor, right? Very pro-Roman, okay? That gets halted in protest, right? Starts with an issue of Greeks practically taunting the Jews. It starts to devolve in argumentation and small little fights, unarmed skirmishes, that is to say, like actual fights. There's then basically a political response, right? To stop those prayers in the temple is not just a religious thing, that's a definitive political response, okay? And so this only continues to basically further kind of inflame things. Protests about taxation kind of just get tacked on to the list of grievances as all this is going through, right? So it's expanding in what we're actually protesting against, so to speak. The Jews, particularly in Jerusalem, you start to find, tax upon unarmed Roman citizens in the city. Think of it like the equivalent of like a blind coward punching King's Cross type of deal, right? Unarmed, attacks on unarmed Roman citizens in the city. So this is only further inflaming things, right? Because this is obviously, in that context, that's an individual Jew who thinks he's going out there and making a difference, and he's beaten the living daylights out of this Roman citizen in Jerusalem, right? It's uncoordinated, it's chaotic by definition, right? All it's doing is it's literally just adding fuel to the fire, right? In response to this, okay, Florus, right, the Roman procurator of Judea, he decides to plunder the temple treasury. Okay, the temple is where the treasury was. We covered in weeks past, particularly last week, the fact that in the Roman context, the temple was basically the bank, for all intents and purposes at least. Right, the temple was the centre not just of religious life, but also like the medium or the mechanism of the financial and economic, culture of Rome. Okay, very similar in this case. Again, this is the temple treasury in Jerusalem, right? The temple itself. He sacks the temple basically, he plunders it, sends troops in, and they take out 17 talents of money. You're probably familiar with talents throughout the Gospels, throughout the New Testament. Long story short, a talent is essentially, roughly speaking, about £100. Okay, £100. So in other words, in this case, like 1,700 pounds, which I've rounded off to basically 770 kilos. So they go in the temple and take 770 kilos of money, like gold, silver, et cetera, like the massive haul. They plunder the temple, and this is all under the guise of reclaiming unpaid taxes. So they don't act like our tax office at all. This doesn't go well, again, as I'm sure you can very well imagine. The Jews basically respond with like 3 levels of response, kind of in pretty quick succession, practically simultaneously. They engage in one of the most beautiful acts of trolling I've ever seen in my life historically. They basically start, in response to this, they start handing around the city like baskets, like we have these things for the offering, right? So they hand around baskets all around the city, taking up a collection for Florus because he must be poor. That's why he came and plundered our temple, right? So they're mocking him as like, oh, he needs charity. We need to give him some money. Do you know what I mean? So there's mocking him like in the most like brutal public way. That being a Roman, I'm sure he definitely did not take offence to. And that then escalates at the same time to rioting in Jerusalem. And the rioting is not just merely destruction of public property, but they start killing Roman soldiers. Okay. They start killing Roman soldiers. Further escalations. See how this has started? This has started with some Greeks being insulting in Caesarea Maritima. that then has some fights, unarmed, we assume from the historical record. It then brings a political protest in the form of the temple in Jerusalem. They stop offering prayers and sacrifices for the emperor. So then the Roman authorities turn around and plunder the very temple that Caesar was not being honoured in. And so then the Jews turn around, they mock the Roman authorities, they start rioting, and then they start killing. You see how this is just escalating and escalating and escalating and escalating? It's just constant back and forth. The word de-escalation practically has left the dictionary at this point. There's no attempt to de-escalate on any side. It's just literally just shooting shots across the proverbial bow. Escalation, escalation, escalation. Okay? This gets to the point where Florus decides to drop the hammer, all right? He sends in a significant force of Roman military, nothing compared to the force that's going to descend upon them in the next 4 years, but they raid Jerusalem, right? So they raid the city of Jerusalem full-blown. They round up and they arrest the major Jewish leaders in the city, I believe, off memory, including the high priest. Don't quote me on that. I'm pretty sure they arrest the high priest in that too. It's sometimes hard to keep track because of which high priests come and go. But long story short, all the major officials from the Jewish side of the equation are taken up from the Sanhedrin. They then torture them and crucify them, right, very publicly as well. This is made, and what makes this even worse is the fact that many of those Sanhedrin guys, like many of those Jewish leaders, are actually Roman citizens. Crucifying Roman citizens, super duper astronomically out of this world illegal. They're patently illegal. It's lucky that the Caesar didn't turn around and behead Florus right there and then. Right, super duper illegal. Right, you cannot crucify Roman citizens. Crucifixion was reserved for the absolute worst scum criminals on the planet, and none of them could be Roman. Right, this is why crucifixion was given to Jesus, okay? Because on the Roman side of the equation, it was the worst, most painful, and most disgraceful and dishonourable death that one could suffer. That's why the crucifixion happened from like just the purely, socio-cultural perspective. But they crucify these Jewish leaders, and a number of them, many of them actually, are Roman citizens. So this is super. So Roman law, which is meant to bring order, it's being flagrantly violated. So now it's just on for young and old at this point. Do you know what I mean? Because now even the Roman authorities aren't even upholding Roman law anymore. This is just pure vengeance at this point. Does that paint the picture? Yeah. This kicks all of this religious and nationalistic tension into hyperdrive, right? Because now, this was already devolving and getting bad, but now as soon as these guys crucified the Jewish leaders who were Roman citizens, all bets are off. It's just on for young and old. It's just a train. It's a train wreck, and so exponentially just sets it off to the races. So, in response to that, what's the response? You then have these Jewish nationalistic factions. The two most famous and important of which we will talk more about, of course, over the coming weeks heavily, and they'll be written down, of course, throughout there. You have the Zealots and the Sicarii. The Zealots you may be familiar with from the New Testament. Simon the Zealot, who converts, right? You have a scenario where he had converted out of the Zealots and converted to Christ. So he's known as Simon the Zealot. He's not a zealot anymore, but the Zealots were a violent paramilitary faction of the Jews, okay? Very willing to use armed force in armed rebellion and armed insurrection, very willing to engage in full-blown armed insurgency, and were begging for it. That's why we get the word zealot in English. It's directly from that word, right? Zealotry, to be like super passionate but not tempered by reason or logic. That's what zealotry is, because that's what the Zealots were, okay? The other group, the Sicarii, which is where we get the modern Spanish word sicario from. Sicario in modern Spanish means hitman or assassin. So, Mexican cartels have sicarios. They have hitmen or assassins that, take out an opposing jefe or cartel boss, for example. The Sicarii were called so because a Sicarii is a type of dagger. Okay, in the first century in Greco-Roman culture, it's a type of dagger. So you can imagine the concept of a Sicarii, dagger in the cloak, walking up to assassinate someone. Okay, they assassinate people all the time, right? These are the violent factions of the Jews. Okay? There are other ones other than that, because again, we keep in mind it's a spectrum that fluctuates, right, in ideology, but the violent nationalistic ones, the most prominent of which are clearly the Zealots and the Sicarii, they then go, thank you very much, this is exactly what we've been asking for, and they launch a full-blown, full-scale armed insurrection against the Roman authorities. So they attack and overrun the major Roman military garrisons in Jerusalem itself, right? And they kill a bomb load of Roman soldiers. They're pretty much ignoring, again, you can understand why, contextually. It's another example of the difference between understandable and excusable. Things can often be inexcusable whilst also being very much contextually understandable. We have clear accounts from Josephus and I think as well Tacitus, the other first Roman historian in the first century, who describe and explain the fact that there are a number of these garrisons where the Roman soldiers, at least who were left, surrendered and laid down their weapons. Right? Western Christian military ethics around just war theory very clearly dictate if someone lays down their arms and surrenders, they are to be taken captive. Okay? They can be held as a prisoner of war, they can be traded essentially as the word slave would need more context there, but they can basically be traded as bargaining. That's all within the bounds. But you don't slaughter someone who has surrendered and laid down their weapons surrendering to you, okay? This is the Christian military ethic that then develops strongly during the medieval period and gets obeyed reasonably well for the most part. Here, though, they threw that out the window. Right? That's not just it's not just coming from Augustine, who is the progenitor of what we call just war theory, in the 5th century AD. This goes back to the scriptures. Okay, this goes back to the Old Testament laws of war. Right? They've thrown this out the window. So you have a number of Roman soldiers who, after realising that they've lost a number of their troops, we need to surrender or we'll all die, they surrender and lay down their weapons, and the Zealots, the Sicarii and the other Jews just massacre them. Again, both sides at this point have just kicked law and morality out the window. Both sides, right? Again, though, that doesn't happen if the Romans don't disobey their own rules, right? Crucifying Roman citizens, stupendously, astronomically illegal in every possible way, shape and form. They're not even upholding their laws. Why should we uphold ours? That's basically the response. Immoral, it's not morally excusable at all, but it is contextually understandable, right? So inexcusable, whilst also being understandable, is the balance of the dichotomy of a lot of history, unfortunately. And so by the time we've reached, months later, the end of AD 66, again, this all developed over the course of, weeks and months. By the time we then get to, the latter months of AD 66, any remaining Roman troops in Jerusalem were either captured forcibly or they surrendered, and they were all lynched. Right, so they're all hanged, in other words. So you were surrendering. You were not surrendering. You were surrendering just because you're basically sick of the bloodshed at that point. You weren't surrendering. Didn't get you mercy. Surrendering, you were going to die. Right, because we were going to kill you. That was the Jewish. We're going to kill you all. We're going to slaughter you. We're going to slaughter you all. That was basically the Jewish perspective. No limits, no rules, on for young and old. This is as bloody and barbaric as it pretty much gets, as has been the case throughout much of history. So, to then finish up with the kind of tail end of what this all kind of means and what the implications of this are in the final stages of this initial revolt. Whilst all this has been going on, right, let us not forget about Caesarea Maritima, right? The Greek inhabitants of Caesarea Maritima, when they hear what the Jews are doing in Jerusalem, they start launching attacks on the Jews in Caesarea Maritima. Right? So the Jews are getting attacked by the Greeks. while the Jews are attacking the Romans in Jerusalem. So it's all sides, multiple locations. It's going on in more than just Judea. Eventually it spills out into all of Judea. You've got fighting going on all over the place. But these are the two big epicenters of the problem. The Jews then rally, coordinate and respond in even greater force. They slaughter an astronomical amount of Greeks in Caesarea Maritima, and then they successfully drive out and expel pretty much any living Greek, in other words non-Jew, from not just Caesarea Maritima, of course, but they drive them out of all of Judea, all of Galilee to the north, and they even drive them out beyond Golan or the Golan Heights to the north of that, right? And so this is a mass nationwide or countrywide campaign, basically. The person that's on the quote-unquote throne, they're not on the throne, right, because Herod Agrippa I was the last of the real Herodian rulers, the last of the Herodian dynasty. His successor, inverted commas, Herod Agrippa II, who is the very definition of a puppet ruler. He's not autonomous at all. He's not only completely under the thumb of the Romans, he's completely in cahoots with the Romans. He loves the Romans. He's everything Roman. And he's technically on paper the last of the Herodian dynasty, technically, but not really. He and his sister and the family, they flee Jerusalem, because they were actually in Jerusalem when all this went down, not up in Caesarea Maritima. They were in Jerusalem, and they flee up to Galilee, and then they flee beyond Galilee up into the province of Syria under Roman protection. And then the Herodian dynasty never returns to Judea ever again, not functionally at least. And so this is basically this campaign. The Jews then, kind of having done all this in Jerusalem and Caesarea Maritima, launch basically a nationwide campaign to just purge all of Judea and surrounding territories of all Roman citizens, all Roman symbols and different cultural and architectural things, as well as any Roman sympathiser. I mean, as far as the Zealots and the Sicarii particularly, but other groups as well, as far as they were concerned, if you happened to breathe within 3 feet of a Roman 10 years ago, they were going to drive you out, right? It was just, if you had anything, if you looked at a Roman for more than 3 seconds, it was just purging the land of anything Roman was basically the goal in this campaign. It's a popular uprising from the ground up, whilst also being kind of coordinated by the leaders of these various factions, but keeping in mind they're factions, so there's a massive amount of infighting between all of them anyway. Vis-a-vis what we saw earlier, it wasn't just around the empire Greeks fighting Jews, it was Hellenistic Jews and Hebraic Jews as well. This becomes really important when we get to the climax of the fall of Jerusalem, in which an event of sabotage occurs, but I'll leave that for later weeks. So therein ends this afternoon's lesson. This is a time that has been building up for decades and decades and decades, to the point where it all eventually again reaches another little microcosmic build-up. It starts with a bunch of Greeks taunting some Jews in some city by the sea, and ends up with mass slaughter. All in all, this revolt in that 5-ish month period, at least across the year of 66, about 6,000 people die, at least. So thousands of people slaughtered. That's just the non-combatants, as far as I'm aware. I don't even know what the combatant number would be. But nonetheless, mass bloodshed, mass slaughter, and it's just on for young and old. Absolutely on for young and old. Rules out the window. Rules on both sides have been violated by their own standards. The Romans have violated their own rules. The Jews have violated their own rules. It's absolutely on for young and old. And so that's the pretext of the Jewish-Roman War and of the destruction of Jerusalem, which we'll work our way towards over these coming lessons. So there ends this afternoon's lesson. Are there any questions or comments or anything else along those lines that anyone has? Yes?
So the church at this stage, the Christians, by the end of all this, when we're getting rid of the Roman influence, are they above ground, like they're still Or are they starting to go?
Oh, well, no, they're trying not to. They're trying to make it through the next day.
Right.
But basically, right, more or less. No, they're very much what we would broadly call underground, if you want to call it, obviously. For those who have been with us during our Bible study, we've seen already in these first 10 years that the churches, especially in Jerusalem and surrounding Judea, have to have had, by definition, a very complex, sophisticated, well-planned, well-organised and well-executed network, right? To the point where, for example, and this informs what the crux of your question is, when in those kind of earlier chapters of the book of Acts, kind of before chapter 10, by the time we get to 6, 7, 8, you have Paul and his death squad essentially receiving intelligence that that there are Christians in Damascus. He coordinates his team to travel to Damascus, and this is where we get the whole Paul, then Saul on the road to Damascus encounter, right? He's on his way to conduct an operation against the Christians in Damascus, against the church in Damascus, right? The thing is, though, we're told pretty clearly, the Damascene Christians, so the Christians in Damascus, know that he's coming. So between the lines of all that, and this is what we've seen throughout our study of the book of Acts, what that logically requires is an intelligence network where somehow the church of Damascus has intelligence on what this relatively, not necessarily, covert, but relatively secret kind of special missions unit that is Paul's team is doing. Well, that requires spies. It requires the ability to relay intelligence between places and cities that are sometimes hundreds of kilometres away, right? There's a whole network. Even when Paul is converted, and you may recall from that story, when Paul's converted, he then joins the church in Damascus, who are shocked to see that he's a Christian and they're terrified, right? But then eventually the Jews turn on him, and so he has to escape. And the Christian church in Damascus, the church of Damascus, gets him out of Damascus immediately. Well, what does that mean? That means that they had escape routes that they'd already planned, that they'd already built or figured out, whatever the deal was, but they already had it in place. They didn't just figure that out on the fly. It means that they knew, how can we get out of this city if it goes into lockdown, if it goes into a martial law kind of setting, what we'd say today, right? So intelligence, networks, planning, all this kind of stuff. The Church of Jerusalem's the first church, and they'd been doing it the longest, so that means they would have had the best and the most developed system. It's literally counter-espionage, counter-intelligence. It reads like a spy novel practically, right? But that's what they would have had, if that makes sense. They had to have had it, right? They get told, right, throughout, obviously you find it in the Gospels, you find it elsewhere, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, flee to the east. This is one of those things I was referencing earlier, right? Josephus' account, obviously, spoiler alert, but we'll talk about it later, but Josephus tells us the fact that the Christians did that. When they saw Jerusalem about to be surrounded by the Roman army, they fled to the hills in the east. And there the command is given there in Matthew 24, whatever it is, don't hang around the rooftops, don't go nice and slow, don't bother bringing your things with you, right? Hope that you're not a pregnant woman when that happens, because you're going to have to be moving really slow. And you can't move slow. You have to get out right now. Right? So the church the Church of Jerusalem heeds that, given to them prophetically by Christ there in the Olivet Discourse, and they do that. And Josephus accounts for it. And he's not a Christian, he's a Jew. He's a Jewish Roman. Josephus switched sides halfway through the war and fights for the Romans. And so he gives this account that's not a Christian account of that very thing. So they were enduring, they were making sure they didn't die, right? And then they were just waiting for that moment that Christ had already told them about decades prior, by this point, as to when was the moment. When's the moment to escape so that you don't get caught in the hellscape that's about to fall down upon everyone here. Yeah. So they're enduring, they're holding on, and obviously they have to hold on for a couple more years by this point, because this is only 66. This doesn't happen till 68 through to 70, yeah. And so that's the basic understanding. We'll cover that as we kind of go through the weeks, yeah. Any other questions or anything else? Very good. All right. Thank you very much. Next time we shall continue through with the exciting yet terrifying war that now from this point is launched. So thank you.